Today, we're going to be talking about moving forward after loss and beginning to get back into a flow of energy. Because number one here, one of the biggest, most important things after you've either lost a loved one or you've gone through a very significant loss is getting back into your own sense of stability and structure that can help, kind of help you step back up into the world. It's not about overcoming the loss, because the loss is going to be there no matter what. And it's going to transform you. It's going to change how your aura appears. It's going to change your body anatomy. It's going to change your nervous system. It's going to bring up emotions depending on how attached you were to the loss. So it's not going to be about you overcoming it and not feeling any of those feelings. It's about you stepping into your own. And a thing to remember as well is loss can be several things, the death of a loved one or a pet, the end of a relationship, the loss of identity, purpose, or even, your belief system. That could happen. Well, especially going through spiritual awakenings and things like that. A traumatic childhood where you never really felt like you could live. So these feelings sometimes come up and they feel like loss that you've had in your life. A version of yourself maybe that is no longer in existence, and you've stepped into this new version, so there's a grief that happens as you're moving forward. Or even a collective loss. Maybe there's a war that you've been watching in a different country and you feel the significant loss of the collective of people, or world events, climate grief. There's so many different things that can happen that create that sense of loss. And it's important to remember, I remember sitting in this workshop a few years ago, and I was about to do past life regression, trauma healing. And it's where we regress back to certain traumatic events in different lifetimes, and we let the story play out, and then we do some releasing of that energy. And it's so fascinating when I take people back to those parts of their experiences, because a lot of times what comes through is their own potency of their own experience that they're currently going through right now. So I just think it's really awesome when they go through, a past life regression trauma healing. However, I remember sitting there a few years ago, and this woman couldn't stop crying. And we were going around the circle, and I'm having them share what they planned to work on, what emotion they were planning on overcoming in that particular session with me. And so as we got around the room, we got to the woman that couldn't stop crying. And she said, "I don't know why I'm crying so much. As soon as you opened up the healing realm, she's like, I saw the symbols and I burst into tears. And I feel like I'm being called back home. I recently lost a loved one. And I'm on stage 3 of the grief, where I'm bargaining currently." And I remember looking at her and I was just like, oh, she thinks that the stages are linear. And I just kind of was quiet, just observing her. And I said, "Oh, stage 3, are you referencing bargaining?" And she said, "Yes, I'm just trying to make sense of the loss. And it was so significant and it's impacting my life and I'm not able to move forward." And she said, "I've gone through stage 1 and stage 2. So I need to get through stage 3 and 4 and then 5, and then I'm done." And I remember looking at her and I'm just like, wow, that's going to be a rude awakening when she realizes that, that's not the case. That's not how this works. So I remember sitting there looking at her and trying to come up with the right words to say. And finally, I just blurted out, "Listen, I think you're referencing the 5 stages of grief." "Yes, I am. Yeah." And I said, a lot of times people skip all the stages and go to the last stage, or they jump around, depending on where they are in their life and what their emotional state is and attachment level to the loss that they experience. And I said, you've experienced a significant loss. So, you got to understand that going through those stages of grief, you will not be the same on the other side of that. But a lot of times it's not just a stairway where you're walking up, each stage, and then once you completed the stage, you never go back to it. And she said, well, I understand that, but I've done a lot of work, and I'm only going to be, going through these stages once. And I said, you just lost your person. And she just looked at me and she's like, it's only been a month. And I remember looking at her and feeling that grief, feeling that pain, wanting to help her understand that, the stages of grief are not just where you can just overcome it and move on and slap it in the face. And, and I think there's a lot to be said about that, because I think people spend a lot more time doing these spiritual techniques and these spiritual workshops to bypass their experience with loss, because it is so incredibly uncomfortable. And so what that woman was revealing wasn't that she understood grief. It was more that she understood that the pain was so great that she just wanted a set goal, a set destination that was at a distance that she could overcome to, because grief is so wild. It is so vast. It is like an ocean, and that ocean can be non-tameable a lot. So imagine, going through one of the worst losses in your life, and, it feels like an ocean that has hurricanes all over it. And, it's moody, it's unpredictable, and the depth layer, like, you don't even know how deep it is. The temperature is really honestly the only thing you can truly predict, but everything else can be kind of mysterious, and even what is within that ocean is mysterious as well. And I feel like that's a great way to explain grief, because we really don't know what's going to come up to the surface. Now, I just had a conversation with a practitioner friend about grief and loss and things of that nature, because I recently lost my mother, and it gave me a whole new outlook on life, and it transformed the way that I perceive loss. And I want to talk about that in a minute, but before we go further, I want to address what are the 5 stages of grief. According to the Kubler-Ross concept, it would be denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then acceptance. And, I think people feel like they could just move through each stage. And I remember years ago teaching a grief class. It was a pretty straightforward class that discussed the different mechanisms of grief and how it transforms our lives. And I was really working on combining emotional mastery and spirituality concepts. And it was beautiful for what it was in that class, but I definitely can attest to the fact that since then, I've experienced some significant losses that have dramatically shifted my perspective, as well as the way that I channel. And some of it has been harrowing in the sense of like changing my whole perspective on life. Like, it felt like I was being thrown out in the ethers, but nothing compared to losing my mother. I mean, I've been shunned my whole life. Well, I shouldn't say my whole life, but like since I was 21, I've been shunned by family, and that felt like a death in of itself. And it was very difficult for me to accept and honor the grief process of it. But losing my mother to a sudden overdose really kind of sent home a message that I can't possibly even put into words. All I can say is that the next day that I woke up and I didn't know who I was anymore. I had this business that I've been working in for years, and I was known as that past life girl, that girl that was the psychic medium, the girl that could take your crazy away, the girl that could read trauma, the girl that could channel serial killers. I was known specifically for the work that I did and how I, never really hold anything back from my personal life into my professional life. I mean, meaning that I share a lot, And for the first time in my life, I didn't want to share out loud. I didn't want to grieve out loud. I didn't want to get louder. I wanted quiet. I wanted silence. I wanted to be alone, and I wanted to connect back to my friends. And I wanted to allow myself to process what happened. And I think the biggest thing that I realized in this was that not only was I grieving the loss of my mother, and I still am for that matter, but I'm also grieving the loss of the identity that I was when my mother was alive. And so I'm going to dedicate a little bit of this episode, actually a lot of this episode, to talking a little bit more about the complexity of grief when you're combining trauma into it. And I think that that's what really impacts people on a regular basis. It's not just the loss of that person, it's the loss that comes with the identity that you had with that person. So it's not just them. You're grieving who you once were when they were alive. And depending on what role you played, whether you were a mother, a daughter, an aunt, a grandmother, a coworker, a boss, it just depends on what kind of role you played and how attached you were to that role. It impacts how much you experience as you go through that grief. And so for me, my mother was the person who created the most pain in my life. She was convicted for abusing me around 14 years old. And I had told on her, and she had gotten in trouble and ultimately convicted. And for a number of years, I didn't talk to her. I would say almost about 4 or 5 years, I did not speak with her. And probably about that 6th year, I actually reached out to her and started connecting. And after that, her and I had a very difficult relationship because I was learning boundaries. I was learning how to show up and how to come towards her. So we would go on hiatuses where we wouldn't talk, and then we would come back and connect again. And then towards the end of her life, it got more consistent, almost predictable behavior. And I was going through, my goodness, my mom just passed on March 30th, and I've been going through crazy things, like a breakup in the last 6 months, and then a change in my living situation, and just all new circumstances. And I was working through my own mental health issues that came with it. And then I get a phone call from my estranged aunt, who's letting me know that my mother was found passed away. And I actually can pinpoint the moment that my mom passed away. I was walking in Target with my partner, and my head sank, and I dropped, I don't even know how to explain it other than my whole energy, my whole essence came out of my body as I was walking and pushing this cart. And I looked down at my feet because I felt like the air taken out of me. I really gasped while I was in Target. And, my partner stopped and reached over, and she's like, "Are you okay? What just happened?" And I said, "I don't know. I feel like maybe I just walked into an energy bubble." I didn't want to acknowledge what had just happened. And I think even my whole consciousness was not even aware of what happened, but it was like as if a semi truck had just come over and just ran over my energy. And I was turning like pale in the face, and I remember looking down at my feet, and I was so fixated on my feet because I'm like, I need to just keep walking. We were headed out of the Target anyways. We had a cart full of stuff, and I was just like, I'm fine. And I remember standing there, at the register, and I was literally blanking out, like what was going on. I don't even think I could comprehend. And I was just like, there's something significant happening to my energy, and I didn't know what it was. Anyways, long story short, I felt like so dramatically different, right? And I even looked at the time because I was just like, why am I feeling this way? This is so dramatic. Well, what ended up happening was I got in my car, started driving, which I don't recommend driving when you feel like that, but I was definitely driving, probably shouldn't have. But I was driving, and we stopped at a red light. And while I was at the red light, I opened up the window, put my hand out of the vehicle, and started taking giant deep breaths in and out. And I really honestly kind of just sent the energy back to Target, wherever it was that I had picked it up, because that's what I thought was happening. As soon as I did that, I gasped again, like as if I was like coming up from the water, like where you haven't been able to breathe in the water, and then you're like gasping for air. That's what I did. And my partner looks at me and she's like, okay, what is going on? Like, are you okay? Like, what happened just now? And I was like, I was just, I feel like there's something significant happening. I don't know. I honestly don't know. I'm fine. I just sent the energy away, but I just went through a series of very heavy thoughts and feelings, and the density was so heavy I couldn't even breathe, barely. And she's like, do you need me to drive? And I'm just like, no, we're fine. Which I don't recommend that. So if you are going through an experience like that, or you're a channeler or a healer and you start experiencing that, ground yourself, take a long, brisk walk around the parking lot before you go and get in the vehicle. But I was okay. I drove and I got home. And once I got home, I had this on edge feeling, more stronger than I've had in months, where I felt like there was something that was dramatically going to shift or change about my perspective. And I didn't know what it was. I didn't, at that point, I wasn't really doing a lot of, live stream work and work like I wanted to be doing. I was doing a lot of session work, but just not back up to par with what I was doing prior to the breakup that I experienced last year. So long story short, about 3 hours later, I get a phone call from my estranged relative letting me know that my mother passed. And I remember sitting down and I burst into tears. And it was like all of it came together. I realized in that moment that I had experienced my mother passing the moment that she passed. And there was some sort of solidity with that, but then also there was a sense of knowing that came over me. My estranged relative said, we don't know anything. We don't know what happened yet to her. But she did pass away. And we'll let you know as soon as we know more information, and, yada, yada. So we'll get off the phone with her. And I remember sitting there and bursting into tears, and I look at my partner comes over and hugs me, and I look at my partner and I said, she passed away by overdose. And my partner just looks at me and she's like, what do you mean she passed away by overdose? Do they know that? And I said, no, but I do. I know in my bones that is how she passed away. And I asked some questions in my head to my mother. And I looked at my partner and I said, she passed away accidentally. And sure enough, as the weeks went on, there was an autopsy performed. And I'm so grateful that we were able to get so much information and closure as time went on, because it made it easier to cope with the loss of my mother. And my mother left a destruction. I gotta be honest, a destruction in her own life. Like her life was riddled with relationships that she used, people that she used on a regular basis. She didn't really get her life where she wanted to get it. She was always missing the mark. And she would get excited about something. She'd start going down a path, and then there would be some sort of obstacle or something that would shake her up, and then she'd shoot back to a behavior that she wasn't healthy. And my mother wasn't, this like addict that constantly, used, but she was a occasional user. And it was especially in the times when it would become more difficult, which, funny enough, I do feel like, she really had those mannerisms of bipolar disorder, where she would have these extreme couple of weeks, and then it would be followed by a shift in the energy, and then she'd have another extreme level of weeks, and she would do certain things in those weeks where it was more manic than when she would be, like kind of like in a more grounded, stabilized state. And so I think that more than ever kind of would sum up my mother, would be like, it was like bipolar on steroids. I don't know how else to describe it, but that was what I was so used to, and so used to her, behavior being kind of erratic at times, to where, it was almost like comfort in the pattern that she was. And I talked to my mother more than most people did. My mother was my cheerleader. And what I find even more fascinating is that as much as she hurt me, she is still to this day my number one supporter, the one that out of everybody, she came back. She chose to mend things, to honor our connection, to, take accountability for her actions, and to show love and really, honestly, compassion after the experiences that she went through. And then, yeah. So I've been talking about my mother, and I gotta be honest, there's still a lot that I am processing with the loss of my mother, but I will say the biggest thing that I've noticed is the loss of identity that I've had. I went from feeling like I had some sort of understanding of what direction I needed to stand up and start working on, into no understanding at all of which direction I needed to move in, and even a loss in confidence in myself and those around me, and even my own sense of confidence in my work. And, it's interesting, when we go through a significant loss, usually what will come up is different layers of feelings, and a big layer of feeling is self-doubt. Self-doubt is very significant in that it comes in and it makes you question the things that you're doing, that you were once doing in a very fabulous way, and now you're questioning everything about what you're doing and how you're doing it. And it makes sense that, in this reality, we live in this universe that's in a constant state of perpetual transmutation of energy. So it's always moving. There's all these intricate parts that are shifting and transforming. And it has a sequence, it has a pattern, but sometimes it can feel like you've been kicked out into the ethers and you're floating in space. It can feel like you have been kicked off a ship and you're in the middle of a freaking tsunami type level wave, 50-foot waves that are like knocking you upside the head in the ocean. It can feel like you have been dropped in the middle of the Amazon and you don't know your left from your right, to your east to your west. And it can be so incredibly overwhelming that you end up becoming paralyzed in that. And I think that we need to honor the fact that that is a part of loss. That's a part of experiences that we have where life is not meant to be this cookie cutter, happy experience where everyone gets along and it's super peaceful. And I've talked to many different people about this. A lot of people, I think, have this expectation about life, that there's not going to be obstacles, that there's not going to be challenges, and that there most certainly is not going to be loss. Because and I think there's even this belief, not even thinking about this too much, I do a lot of past life regression trauma healing. And one thing that comes up, at least a theme that comes up a lot for my clients, is the belief that they did something inherently wrong for why they have the obstacle that they're being presented with. Almost as though they lived in a time period where the belief as a society norm was that if they received bad weather conditions that impacted the growth of their goods, it meant that they lost God's favor. Or like, for instance, it would be like that Viking show when they got into a predicament in their boat and their boat capsized and it was in the middle of a storm. And a lot of the men were saying, oh, we've lost favor with God. I think Loki even said that. And I think there's something fascinating about that belief that we could lose favor with God and with our spirit guides and with, the energy that is quote unquote here to support us, that just by going and having an obstacle be presented to us. But it's very important to remember that is not how things happen. And because if that was the case, then we would have all lost favor with God long ago. The reality is that we're here for such a short amount of time, and we don't come to Earth just to have this beautiful, loving, doting experience where we don't experience anything traumatic. Now, there are times where we may come to Earth and we play a certain role where maybe we don't have as much obstacles or trauma. However, a soul chooses a body that's going to provide them deep, powerful lessons that can be transformative and invoke purposes to come through in that. Does that make sense what I'm saying? I wonder if that even makes sense. So it's really important to understand and honor that, our purpose isn't just this linear experience. It comes through these obstacles, these experiences that we have here on Earth that are dramatic, that are transformative. It's the stuff that knocks you off the cliff that really send you into your calling. But you have to go through the experience of the loss. You have to fall to your knees, experience that loss, have it shift your reality a bit, shake up things, create feelings that impact you on a deep level, one of them being self-doubt. And self-doubt is such a powerful feeling that I feel like is the most misunderstood. I've heard psychologists talk about it. I've heard other spiritual practitioners discuss it. And in the end, self-doubt is really about the calling of your belief system. And the calling of your belief system is the challenge, really. It's about challenging the way that you see yourself after you experience, loss. It's the way that you believed prior to that experience. And I want to kind of generalize it even more. It's the way that one believes prior to their experience that now is in a different energy. And when we have that self-doubt come up, it's like clashing of two different belief systems that are not, and one is not in alignment any longer. A case in point would be when I had self-doubt about, about how people passed away. And being a medium and a psychic, I had a concept about what happens when we die. However, there was also the other rule of thumb where I was not in a place where I could fully, what would be the word? Fully believe what new adaptations I was adopting. Let me be a little bit more personal on this matter. Like, for instance, I believe that we pass away and then we go into the spirit realm, and that spirit realm is in different layers. However, everyone passes away. No matter what they did, they go through like what you could equate to a light energy. After going through that light energy, they end up in what I call a waiting realm. And then they go in front of what's called the karmic board, which is the high celestial court. And then from there, they may get another bodysuit. They may spend more time doing other roles, because a lot of times souls move in clusters together. So like hundreds of souls move in one motion together. So all of them have to pass away in the same kind of wave length. I don't know how to make that make sense, but that's just kind of the gist of what I've believed in, right? And then I believe in reincarnation, that souls come back to Earth for additional human experience. And that is transformative. I believe that souls can go to other planets and other universes, and I believe in the quantum side of it as well. But at the same time of believing all of those things, I also was raised Jehovah's Witness, and in a very devout household. And part of that belief system was that we return to dust when we pass away. Part of that belief system was that we would be resurrected in a paradise earth. Part of that belief system is that if you talk negatively about Jehovah God, you could cease to exist and no longer be able to be resurrected here on earth. And I am considered, I guess you could call me an apostate. I don't really like that word, but I guess you could consider me an apostate in the sense that I have spoken up against Jehovah's Witnesses, in a lot of ways. I've been very open about my experiences with Jehovah's Witnesses, and then being shunned by Jehovah's Witnesses. I've had a lot to say about that. And there are millions of Jehovah's Witnesses, and there are all kinds of groups who've walked away from Jehovah's Witnesses. But it's very dramatic a lot of times because, this is one of the only religions. There's a few religions out there still that shun, but this is one of the only religions that does the shunning in the way that they do the shunning, and it is devastating to experience that. So anyways, with that said, the more that I got into my spiritual journey, the more that I focused on, different holistic concepts and different spiritual philosophies, the more that it challenged the belief system that was formulated as a young child. And the more that I had obstacles come up in my way, the more that it dramatically shifted or transformed the way that I saw myself. And it was through the feelings of self-doubt and imposter syndrome that I started understanding that it was more about my belief system than it was anything else. So it's very important and vital that, when you start feeling doubt, it's not that you're doing something wrong. It's not that what you're currently doing is not in alignment with you. It's that you need to examine what belief systems you had prior to what you're doing now, and honor the parts of you that may not be in alignment with that old belief system that you had. And sometimes it's dramatic, for me, it was a bit more dramatic because I struggle with, some mental health issues, and, in going through some different forms of holistic training, especially in somatic therapies where it's moving energy out of your body, I noticed that the more that I did that type of therapy, the more that it brought up trauma from the past, which made me challenge the belief systems that I had. And I remember being in the shower one day, thinking about ceasing to exist, and it was so uncomfortable, so incredibly uncomfortable. I couldn't even bear the feelings that came up. I stood there in the shower, sob crying, because there was so much fear behind the belief that I would cease to exist. And I know that's so egoic, because, our soul is so transformative. It's infinite. It never dissipates. It cannot be erased. It cannot be deleted. It can only transmute. However, this bodysuit, to fathom, and I want you to think about that for a second, to fathom loss, to fathom such a short amount of time here on Earth, that is really, honestly, a hard concept to fathom in our brains, because these brains are riddled in our ego, right? But I like to say the ego is a good thing. It's not a negative thing. I think it's a beautiful thing. I will get into that in later episodes. But to fathom loss, in this bodysuit, it can be very hard to understand it, because this bodysuit is so temporary. And so for me, a very dramatic, adaptation of that would be me being in the shower and really feeling that sense of ceasing to exist, and the fear, because honestly, that's what it was deep fears that were beneath the surface of, oh my God, I'm going to cease to exist. What if I actually cease to exist? And I had to face that fear, sit with that shadow. It took me about, funny enough, I had spent over 20 years in the religion of Jehovah's Witnesses, and I was fully in it. Kind of like when I was a kid, I was forced to read the Bible and, forced to go door to door and talk about the Bible. So I had to learn a lot about Jehovah's Witnesses, and I was trying to prove to myself the sanctity of that religion. They claim to be the one true religion, and I was trying to prove it to myself. So I spent a number of years adopting the belief systems that my father, ingrained in me. And so, coming through that, coming to this this existential crisis, this identity that I had formulated all these years, and kind of facing the biggest elephant in the room, the biggest fear, it sent waves through my body. My entire sense of being was impacted by just even the thought of ceasing to exist. And I had to get to the point where I acknowledged enough of that fear, and I got to be honest, all of the fear. And once I acknowledged all of it, and I, let the fear fully come up, and, really honored what could happen, what I thought could happen, all the different mechanisms to that particular belief system. And I gotta remind you, this isn't even it's taking me years and years and years to do this. This was a series of events that happened, getting me to this one breakout moment in the shower, and just sitting with the fear long enough to allow it to move through my body. By the end of that, I was in this place where it's not that I didn't care about the ceasing to exist. It's just that I really love my belief system more. I felt like I needed to accept that it was okay that I believe differently, and that it's okay that my belief system might not necessarily be the truth, but it's the belief system that up until this moment, I fully 1000% believe in, which is in past life regression, in that reincarnation. And that alone was so soothing to my soul, so soothing to my body, that it brought in this whole new perspective. And we'll talk more about that in later episodes. But I want to talk about that for a moment, just because it is so significant when you go through the loss of a loved one, that it's only natural that you'll question the belief systems that you had prior to that. And, my mom did not pass away in that moment when I was going through that change of perspective. But that's what self-doubt does. It's this powerful, potent alert system going off. And it's not, you have to challenge what you're aligned with. It's more about just making sure that you honor what you once were aligned with and what you're now aligned with. And so it's about sitting in that uncomfortability. And I've talked a lot about that to different practitioners, about sitting with your shadow long enough to see yourself in it. And that's what I literally mean, is sitting with your shadow, sitting with the darkest fears that you have, the skeletons in your closet, the demons that you're so scared of, sitting long enough with that energy, not for it to traumatize you, but for you to understand your own light in it, is so potent. It's so powerful to have that experience. And loss is a fact of life. We cannot make it out of this earth without losing this bodysuit, without losing loved ones. The only way you could prevent that would be to, live up in the mountains somewhere and never interact with anybody and never connect with anyone and stay alone completely for the rest of your life. But let's be real, that wouldn't really be an experience at all. I bet it could be an experience, but there's something powerful about being able to connect with others and get all these different viewpoints and perspectives that then shape your perspective and help you hone in what aligns with you and what doesn't align with you. There's something very potent about that. So with that said, how do you start moving forward, after loss? It's really important that you name the loss that you're experiencing and what persona you had with that loss. For me, looking at my mother, acknowledging my mom has passed away, my mom is dead. For me, that took me some time because there was the initial shock that came up, followed by deep feelings, of the past, like the betrayal wounds that I had with my mother. Even though we did a lot of healing work together and I had moved through a lot of it in different layers, there was this whole new layer of what had actually happened that came up to the surface. There was nostalgia, there was laughter, there was joy, there was excitement, there was deep sorrow that came up. And then there was, who the fuck am I? Like, who am I after all of this that came up? So really naming it. And for me, I had to honor being a daughter, and losing the sense of being a daughter. I had to honor the trauma that I had went through in my life and the loss of identity that I had formulated with that trauma, which I didn't really feel like I had an identity with the trauma, but I did identify with some of that trauma. So acknowledging that I have a persona of being the girl who was abused by her mother that now is passing away, that whole persona is gone. And I had to also honor the fact that, that most people will never know how deep of a love that I had for my mother. And I think about that sometimes. I think about how much compassion both of us needed to have. Because when you think about it, me talking to my mom again and building a relationship with her, not everybody has the luxury of doing that with their abuser and being able to set boundaries with them and heal by having experiences with them. But my mother also had to have a lot of love and an open heart and compassion to be able to come back towards me, because most people who abuse others don't want to talk about it, don't want to take accountability, and don't want to acknowledge the significance of what they've done. However, that's what my mom, in a hyper sense of that term, she wanted to acknowledge it, and she took accountability, and she did shift things in her life in her own ways, in the best way that she could. So being able to witness her and have those experiences was powerful, but it also created a new layer of grief because there were things that I still wanted my mom to acknowledge about me and the work that I was doing. However, I'm grateful for what I was acknowledged for and what I had the luxury of experiencing with her. So part of the loss, right? In kind of working through the grief process and moving forward is acknowledging the roles, the personas, and even the labels that you have become attached to with that said person. And it's not just about, like, oh, I acknowledge it, but doing some sort of ritual. I'm always about rituals or like some sort of like sanctity to the experience. How can you honor the experience of that? Does that make sense? Like, honor the labels that you once had, saying goodbye to them and really stepping into your own, but doing like a little ceremony or some sort of ritual to honor the parts of you that are releasing that label or that persona that you once had with that particular person. So we want to acknowledge that persona, but then we also want to tend to the emotional experience of that loss, right? So then it becomes about allowing yourself the space and presence. You want to get more still than you've ever been in your life, and not like still like you're moving in slow motion or you're not moving at all. It's moving in a more calculated and intentional way. It's slowing and pausing when you start to have emotional experiences or collapse come up. It's honoring the essence of what you're truly feeling behind the lens, right? So when you're crying, let yourself cry and let yourself fully be in it without being critical or without judgment of that experience. Really giving yourself permission to grieve is important as well. And I think people dishonor that experience because they're like, yeah, my mom lost, of course I'm grieving, but they're not actually acknowledging, my mother passed away or so-and-so passed away, and, I'm in grief and I'm allowed to be in grief. My grief is valid. Even having a mantra that says my grief is valid could be an opening door, an invitation to your human experience, right? To have the full human experience. And so with that said, you want to really let yourself feel those feelings, the rage that comes up, the anger, and do something with it. Sometimes, it's just sitting in it, right? Like crying or letting that come up. But other times it can be something that you need to move out of your body, like dance it out, like smack it out. Like, when I say smack it out, like I'm talking about like grabbing a pillow and like flinging it on the bed over and over again, like in quick succession. There was a video clip I watched once on TikTok where there was a character, she was going through a loss and it was so complicated. She depicts it so well. She's standing on the edge of the bed and she's literally talking to herself, and she gets into it and she is like pounding on that pillow and she's angry, but it's her healing. Her acknowledging those feelings, her moving that energy out of her body. And she's angry. She's just righteously freaking angry. And I gotta be honest, that is such a powerful place to be in. Because if you can sit there and acknowledge your feelings and not dismiss them, not negate them out, not invalidate them like the people that you've had in your past you've invalidated, you're literally co-parenting your inner child by doing that. So honor that glory, honor that feeling, honor the emotions that are coming up to the surface, and give yourself that permission to have that experience, to cry, to not cry, to collapse, to laugh, to be rageful, to be unsure about the next step of your life, and understand that it's normal when you go through a loss, that you go through an identity shift, and through that identity shift, your frequency starts to shift, right? And when your frequency and aura layers are starting to shift around and your chakras are either being awoken or more stagnant or whatever the case is, there's a feeling of being lost with no sense of direction that comes up. And I know that feeling. Oh my God, do I know that feeling. I've taught that in workshops. I talk about it all the time because no matter what you do in your life, whatever the loss is, from time to time, you are going to have a feeling of being lost with no direction. And if you think about being stuck in the wilderness, survivalists will tell you not to try to move in like a million different directions and try to figure it out, especially on an empty stomach. They'll tell you to set up camp, to look for food sources, and to spend more time like kind of at this camp to recalibrate before moving forward. And that's really what you want to do when you've had a loss, is recalibrate, sit with it, set up shop, set up camp, allow yourself to feel the feelings that are coming up, and trust that while you feel that loss with no sense of direction, it doesn't mean that you will always feel that loss of no sense of direction. But for now, you're feeling it. For now, you don't have a sense of direction, and it's because things are shifting. And allow yourself that experience. And something that you want to do is not force clarity, but instead focus on grounding. Focus on anchoring yourself into the moment of the loss. Focus on not having a direction in your path. Focus on, really bringing yourself a sense of structure and stability within that loss. And I got to be honest with you, the more uncomfortable you are, the greater the transformation is going to be. And remember that, because a lot of times I think people get so hung up on how they're feeling. Is this normal? Is this normal? There is no linear way to grieve. There is no linear way to feel the loss of someone or something. You are going to have many things that come up in your life that are going to invoke a complete transformation or a total hauling of your own energy. And the more that you accept that uncomfortability, the more that you allow yourself the space to go through the process of that loss, it can be life-altering in that way. Meaning, like, you could step back up in such an empowered, confident state that you're unrecognizable. And that's really what I'm talking about, is such a transformation where you lost maybe a loved one, or you lost somebody significant in your life. And after that loss, you go through the doubt, you go through all of these feelings, and it's breaking down every part of you. And it's scary, because how do you get back up? You created something in this reality already. So like, what do you do if you can't get back up? But in reality, you collapse, you break down, and then you build back up. And it starts with those moments where you're allowing yourself to feel more of those feelings, and you stop trying to force the need for clarity or a sense of direction, because you can't force something that isn't ready to come through yet. Everything is within divine timing. Not a moment too soon and not a moment too late. This loss is within the timing that you need to experience this in your life, that will then cause you to start going in a certain direction. It's like as if it calls you into a direction. And that's what I talk about, is really sitting with those negative feelings, the uncomfortability, long enough to hear the calling that comes through it, because you will be called. It's not like you're in the wilderness and you have no direction at all, or nothing that's coming through. Sometimes you have to just sit long enough to get recalibrated, and then you find your compass and your map, and you stand up and you start moving forward, or you're called forward. And when you're called forward, a lot of times it's uncomfortable in that way, because people experience job losses or other significant losses in addition to such a great loss. And it's like it calls them back into what is in alignment with them. But That's not the point. The point is sitting with those feelings and allowing yourself to burn through some of those old belief systems, knowing self-doubt is a fact, that it will absolutely come up in your experiences. It's a gnarly feeling. You're gonna have no loss of direction. You're not going to know which way to go. You're going to have inadequacies that come up. You're going to have past trauma that you had. And being open to that loss and that experience doesn't have to be you reliving those negative experiences. It's just about allowing it to shake up in your body. And just allowing your body to go through that experience, within a matter of weeks and months, you can start to shift some of that behavior. Now, what happens if you're years into the loss, right? And you're not moving forward? Well, what that tells me is that we're still so heavily attached to what we were prior to that loss. And then also that tells me how well you've done with flowing with the energy. And sometimes that can be the hardest part, is feeling the feelings and allowing yourself that transparency, but then also beginning to start moving in a direction. And that direction could look like you creating a sense of stability or structure in your life by just little baby steps, creating a routine. That's the biggest thing for someone that has lost somebody. It's creating a routine, doing some volunteer work, getting out of the house, getting up every morning, and allowing yourself quick check-ins throughout the day about what you're really feeling. That can be the saving grace that helps you to begin moving forward. And I feel like that's really what is at least happening with me simultaneously as I write this podcast, as I, come back online. Because I definitely went on a spiritual hiatus with social media. I just don't think that I was performing at the level that I wanted to. And I feel like I also was doing it more out of the overcompensation wound rather than doing it from the place of service like I want to be doing. So coming back online, I have to create a structure that aligns with me in the way that I want to move forward in. And that can be very overwhelming and daunting, right? To think about creating a structure. So it starts with baby steps, a routine. I get up and I show up this way and I do this on a regular basis. And there's a predictability that comes with routine that creates the structure that's needed to then create the momentum and the flow of energy that's needed in your experience. So with that said, there are 5 stages of grief that people go through. I'm just going to run through them real quick. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And it's normal to go through these stages, these feelings that come up. But remember that grief is not linear. It's not something that you can even say across the board is a normal, predictable feeling. It's all over the place. It has its variations of it. It can feel like you are being knocked out into the ethers. It can feel like you are in the middle of the ocean all alone. But remember, you're not alone. This is an experience you are meant to have in this world. And depending on how much you allow yourself to feel is going to dictate how massive of a transformation it can be for you. So know that I love you, and I'm excited to be back here on my first episode of my new season on my podcast. And I'm looking forward to further topics that we will be discussing that will help hopefully, shift some perspectives that you have, or maybe even invoke a whole new perspective that you find or discover as a result of something that you heard today. So with that said, I love you. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.